It is so great to see so many familiar faces in the audience. Holding a talk about Palestine these days in the era of genocide, oligarchy, and authoritarianism has become a bit problematic, to say the least. So thank you for being here. In times of unbearable pain such as these, I take heart in knowing that there are people like you who are doing the important work that is needed more than ever before. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Michel Moushabeck. I'm the founder and editor of Interlink Publishing, a Northampton-based, Palestinian American owned, independent publishing house. Thank you. I write regularly for truthout.org, and most recently I edited the last issue of the Massachusetts Review titled A View from Gaza, featuring the works of 35 Palestinian writers and artists, mostly from Gaza. We are honored to have with us today renowned activist, acclaimed political analyst, and author Phyllis Bennis to discuss Israel's escalating destruction of Gaza, the ongoing struggle for justice in Palestine, the student protest movement, Trump's second term, and his administration's policies as they relate to the stability in the region. And of course, we will also be discussing her latest book, Understanding Palestine and Israel, published by Interlink Publishing. First, a few words about Phyllis Bennis. Phyllis is a fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies, where she co-directs the New Internationalism Project. She serves as an international advisor to Jewish Voice for Peace, and is a leading voice in the US and global movements supporting Palestinian rights and challenging US foreign policy. She has written numerous books on Palestine, the broader Middle East, US foreign policy, and the United Nations, including Challenging Empire, People, Governments, and the UN Defy US Power, Calling the Shots, How Washington Dominates Today's United Nations, and the just released Understanding Palestine and Israel. She's a frequent contributor to Democracy Now!, Al Jazeera, BBC, MSNBC, and others, and writes widely in US and international media. Please welcome Phyllis Bennis. First, I would like to start with a full disclosure. Phyllis and I have been friends for close to, well, for more decades than I care to remember. We have been partners in crime for so long, and we've co-authored and co-edited a couple of books together back in the 90s. So Phyllis and I see things eye to eye most of the time, so I will leave it really up to you guys to challenge her during the Q&A session. So Phyllis, congratulations on the new book.
Thank you, Michel. Thank you for making it happen quickly.
I know you've been very busy over the past couple of weeks. Yesterday you were in Greenfield, before that you were in Boston, and the day before in New Haven and Lenox and Washington, D.C., and tomorrow you'll be in Brattleboro, and then you're going to Santa Fe, and so on. So I know how hard you worked on this book to get it out so quickly, and I know how hard we worked at Interlink to get it out so fast. No topic that I can think of has been more misrepresented and distorted than both in mainstream media and by our government than the subject of Palestine and Israel. Your book is the most timely and up-to-date book out there on the Palestinian struggle for the last 100 years. So please talk a little bit about what the book covers, who did you write it for, how up-to-date is it, and why did you choose the Q&A format for the book?
Thanks, Michel. Thank you all for coming tonight. And thanks to the organizers and the organizations that are sponsoring tonight's event. I know what Michel said is really important for all of us to keep in mind, how difficult it has become to simply have conversations about the question of Palestine, about the role of the United States in supporting Israel, about all of these questions. The cost has gone up. Not yet for us, we've been privileged, but by students, by others, particularly by immigrants in this country who are supporting Palestinian rights, for Palestinians themselves, of course, at the core of it. So I'm grateful for all of that, for seeing people coming out and saying, we want to talk about it, we want to learn about it, and no one has the right to stop us. So that is a really important component of what we're all doing here. On the question of what the book covers, it's a couple of different things, and it has to do with who the book is aimed at. I mean, it's kind of a book for everybody because the bulk of the book is done in FAQ format, which means you don't have to sit and read the whole book at one time. I sort of wish you would, but you know. But you can look at the list of questions. What are the questions that you had that you really thought, God, I thought I knew about this issue, but I really don't know that. You know, what is Zionism? Do all Jews support Zionism? Or what was Oslo all about? Is a two-state solution realistic? Those are the kinds of questions a lot of people have. It's sometimes, for people who are active in the movement, it's a little embarrassing to say that you've been working on this issue for 3 years and you actually don't know, but it makes perfect sense because it's not easy to find out. So this book is aimed at that. But I think the other part that's important is the question of when. You know, when we write books and publish books, and what's happening in the world that we're responding to. Because one of the things that I think is so important is understanding that how we come to understand and act on what the world is around us right now, and how we understand history, has everything to do with when you start the clock. So if you start the clock on October 7th, 2023, which so many people in this country and so much of our government and so much of the mainstream media did and continue to do, as if there were no issues that created the crisis of October 7th, you're going to get one version of history. If you begin your clock, if you start your clock, say, 17 years before that, in 2007, when Israel imposed the full blockade of the Gaza Strip, and suddenly you had 2.5 million people living behind walls in what amounted to an open-air prison, only able to eat the limited amount of food that Israel decided was sufficient, and they decided very explicitly that sufficient meant calorie by calorie per person. How much food should be allowed into the Gaza Strip had everything to do with the minimum amount of food people needed to survive. And it was public. They said in the cabinet meeting, we want to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not starve them to death, yet. That became important. If you start the clock earlier than that, in 1967, when Israel first militarily occupied the Gaza Strip, along with the West Bank, the occupied East Jerusalem, the Syrian Golan Heights, the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula, you would get still a different version of history. And if you started in 1948 with what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe of the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians dispossessed of their land, forced to become refugees, you would get still another. And you could go back as far as you want to the origins of Zionism, whatever. So all of that has to do with when you start the clock. And we decided we needed a resource for people that starts the clock far back, the origins of Zionism. Doesn't start in the Bible, I'm sorry for that. But it starts with when Zionism started at the turn of the 20th century and comes forward all the way up to the epilogue, which was the 2024 election.
Well, it doesn't really just give you the historical background, the facts, and the legal arguments. I think it is the best tool for students, for activists, for those who would like to engage in informed debate. This is where the pitch, my pitch for the book ends.
Good.
So,
But listen to him.
now, can you start by reporting to us on the latest developments across Palestine, Israel? The past 18 months or so have been marked with unspeakable horrors in Gaza, the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Yemen. Israel has resumed its war of annihilation against the Palestinians by unilaterally canceling the ceasefire agreement and cutting off all aid to Gaza. Since then, scores of civilians have been killed, most of whom women and children. Please give us an assessment of the situation now.
I think the first thing that's so important to recognize is that the region-wide crisis that has erupted has everything to do with the Israeli assault on Gaza. When the genocide began, there were immediate responses from people around the world, and particularly people in the Arab world. Most Arab governments did not respond. That's been a long-standing issue. It's not new that Arab governments have little interest in protecting Palestinian rights, despite the significance of it for their own populations. But what has happened in Lebanon, in Syria, all of that has been focused, and in Yemen as well, of course, all of that has been focused on what can we, whoever the we is at that moment, do to stop this genocide. In some cases, the Houthis in Yemen said that the question of genocide requires an international response. Ours is going to be to try to blockade ships from going to make money for the Israeli military. And they've done that. And it's become, of course, militarized. And the US has been involved in recent weeks when we heard Signalgate. You all remember that latest scandal in Washington, scandal du jour, perhaps. The real scandal, of course, got virtually no attention, which was that Yemeni civilians were being killed by these bombing raids that were being discussed so blithely on Signal. The problem wasn't that they were discussing it on Signal. The problem was that they were doing it. And when it leaked, because they invited in the journalist, the editor of the Atlantic, what we didn't hear was, so what are they doing in Yemen? Who are the civilians that are being killed? There was the one extraordinary story of the girlfriend of a leading figure in the Houthis, supposedly. He wasn't named, but it was said in this meeting that he was walking into his girlfriend's house and that building no longer exists. It was destroyed. And no one even asked, was the girlfriend killed too? Did she have anything to do with it? Who else was in the building? How many civilians were killed? We know it was at least 5 children. We don't know all of them because some of them are still under the rubble. But all they sent was a set of messages of congratulations because they had found the right person for something. So, you know, we can go through the various places. In Syria, when the Syrian regime was overthrown, the first action of the Israeli government was to launch bombing raids against the Syrian Navy, wiping out virtually every ship in their Navy. And then they attacked on land a set of military stations, ensuring that this supposedly sovereign country no longer had the capacity to have a military at all. And they began expropriating more land. In Syria, they've announced that they're keeping some of the land that they occupied, and in Lebanon, expanding the buffer zone on the northern border of Israel and the southern border of Lebanon. So what we're seeing is the expansion of land, the Syrian Golan Heights. They're taking that strip of land and expanding it to the east. So this has been a boon for Israel for one reason, which is the government of our country. and the billions of our tax dollars. That has made it possible for Israel to simply use this crisis it has caused, the genocide it has caused across Gaza, to escalate in the West Bank and to expand its land seizures across these other borders. So what we're looking at is a regional crisis that has everything to do with what it takes to stop genocide. The genocide itself, what I said earlier about when you start the clock, you know, when I left a few days ago, I'm a bit confused about what days we're on now on this book tour, but a few days ago I left Washington and I took some notes before I left to have some of the statistics because they change so fast, and I want to be accurate. You know, Reverend William Barber, who is the longtime founder and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, always says, you can't be loud and wrong. And he's right. So if you're going to be loud, and I can be loud, you have to be right. You have to be careful. You can't say stuff that's wrong because you're going to get in trouble.
Give us some of those statistics.
Well, I was just having to change them because the numbers have gone up again. When I left, I noted that beyond what we know, more than 52,000 Palestinians are known to be dead under Israeli assault. And these are individual people where we know their name, their birth date, and their ID number. If they don't have all that information, they're not on the list. There's somewhere between 10 and 15,000, maybe more, buried under the rubble of Gaza, who have never been identified. There are 905 entire families that have been extinguished, where no one from the entire family has survived. So that's what I knew. Those statistics haven't changed. But I also knew that of the 17,000 plus children among those 52,000 that have been killed, there were another 322 that had been killed just since Israel decided to break the current ceasefire on March 2nd. But when I spoke yesterday in Greenfield, I did some checking to make sure that was still right, and no, those numbers had gone up, and it was now 490. But today, I just checked this afternoon, there's another 46 children have been killed. So what's staggering is the scale of this kind of genocidal assault. There's never been a genocide like this that has been visual evidence all over the world, that has been seen by all of us in this room, day after day, hour after hour, on our screens, on our phones, on our computers, on our tablets, on our televisions. We're seeing it in real time. Genocide isn't new. The first genocide of the 20th century was carried out by the Germans in what is now Namibia, what was then Southwest Africa. But there was no one there to watch it and bring it to the West. People didn't know about it, and the people who did were the ones perpetrating it. The genocide in Rwanda in 1994, leaders knew about that, and some people knew. There was some press. It was in the press a little bit. I was at the United Nations at the time. It was being talked about a lot at the United Nations, and they decided not to move against it. But we were not seeing that on our televisions as it happened. We were not seeing children burning to death. We were not seeing what you all have seen. I won't name it all. But we are still seeing now, with this escalation, there's been more than 1,000 people killed in the West Bank in what Palestinians are calling the Gazification of the West Bank. And this, too, is not new. This is the other thing. What's new is it's happening at such a scale, in such visibility. But the notion that Israel is trying to create what never existed, which is a land without a people, is underway as we speak and has been for 75 years or more. So that the idea that you could expel people in a large scale, Sharon's plan in 2005, what he called the Jordan is Palestine plan, was exactly this: force all the Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in occupied Jerusalem out of their land to Jordan and make Jordan Palestine.
I mean, yesterday, Netanyahu, Trump, at the White House, during the meeting, they sent a clear message that only they control life, death, and the future of Gaza and the entire region. Trump and Netanyahu talked about their plan to have Palestinians voluntarily leave Gaza. They both care so much about the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza that they want to give them a better life somewhere else.
Yeah.
You know what he said? He said, oh, plenty of countries are willing to take Palestinian refugees. Are they doing this from the goodness of their heart or the evilness of their minds? And is there such a thing as a voluntary ethnic cleansing?
Ethnic cleansing is not voluntary. What is being called voluntary departure is not voluntary. What Netanyahu said, he has a three-part plan for Gaza. First, we'll get back the hostages by escalating. It's almost impossible to imagine it can escalate, but it can, and it will. First, we will get the hostages back by escalating the military assault on Gaza. Second, we will eliminate Hamas. And then we will arrange the voluntary departure of all the rest of the Palestinians for his version, of course, of a beachfront property on the Mediterranean. And that kind of ethnic cleansing is very much what was at stake in 1948 in the Nakba. The idea was to create a land without a people by getting rid of the people on the land. And that is what is now moving forward at this extraordinary, murderous pace. And one of the important things about this, and it goes to, I will say another thing about the book. Another whole section in the book is about what South Africa has taken the lead on in the International Court of Justice. In the question of genocide, which is of course a legal issue in international law, almost every country in the world is a signatory to the Genocide Convention. And unlike a lot of international law, which is really hard to understand and is designed to be kind of opaque and not accessible to most people, the genocide definition and the Genocide Convention is actually pretty simple to understand. Two things have to happen for an act of violence to be considered genocide. First, it has to include at least one of 5 specific acts of violence against a group. So it can be killing people in the group, injuring people in the group, creating conditions that make it impossible for the group as a group to survive. You don't have to kill anybody to commit genocide. You can commit genocide by massive killing and massive injury, but you don't have to. You can just throw them out and make it impossible for them to survive because you've destroyed their homes, destroyed any shelter, destroyed the water treatment system, destroyed the electrical generating plant, destroyed almost every hospital, every school, every university. That's genocide, an act of genocide. But to be genocide, you need a second thing. That's the first. The second is you need the specific intent to get rid of that group, right? If you just go and kill a bunch of people somewhere, it may or may not be genocide. It has to be with the intent to get rid of these people, to get rid of this group. And usually, it's very difficult to prove that. How do you prove what's in somebody's mind? How do you prove intent? Well, this time around, it was pretty damn easy, because Israeli officials, from the prime minister to the president to the secretary, the minister of defense, to the military leaders, to leading intellectuals and academics and poets and songwriters, and the military leadership and the military forces on the ground all talked about it. They talked about it as, these are human animals and we will treat them as such. They talked about it as, there are no civilians in Gaza. They are all responsible. And why was this language so familiar to many of us in this country? This was the language of the Indian Wars of the 1860s and 70s. Some of you will remember the Sand Creek Massacre, where a leader, a military official who was commanding a group that had just come back from fighting the Civil War, who happened to be a Methodist minister by coincidence, he ordered his troops to kill a group of indigenous native people on the banks of Sand Creek. And some of his soldiers came back to him and said, these are peaceful people sleeping here. We pledged to support, to protect them. We can't just go kill them. There's kids there, old people. And his answer was, nits make lives. Kill them all. That's the language of Bibi Netanyahu. That's the language of Gallant, his minister of defense. That's the language of the Israeli genocide. And because they said it, they announced it, it becomes evidence of that specific intent that is required to turn an act of random violence into an act of genocide. And that's what the Palestinians, working with the South Africans, have brought to hold Israel accountable for the first time.
The genocide is a US-Israeli joint venture. Do you think that without US support, financial, military, diplomatic, Israel's leaders could have been compelled to seek a just resolution for Israel-Palestine instead of pursuing genocide, ethnic cleansing, annexation in order to achieve their ultimate goal?
I think there's no question that the genocide could not have started, could not continue, and would not be going on today as it is today without the US enabling those attacks. The US has provided the funding, provided the weapons, provided the planes, provided the bombs. Now we're seeing another batch of 1,800 2,000-pound bombs, the one that President Biden, in his sole act of holding back anything that Israel asked for, held back for just a couple of months part of a shipment of bombs that included those 2,000-pound bombs. A 2,000-pound bomb can completely destroy the infrastructure and every bit of human life in an entire large city block. They just sent them another 1,800. There's no city blocks left in Gaza. There's not too many people these days left either. But there's no question that the US enabling of that assault is what made it possible. Now, it's not a coincidence that just around the same time that the South Africans were bringing charges against Israel at the International Court of Justice, a group of Palestinians and Palestinian Americans with family in Gaza were bringing a case against President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken in US courts in California, in federal court, charging them with being complicit in the crime of genocide. And a rather extraordinary thing happened. The case did not survive the motion to dismiss. The judge had to dismiss it. And it was a very painful decision, he said, after some weeks of research and trying to figure out, is there any way he could avoid that? And he made the determination that legally the division between the executive branch and the judicial branch meant that he could not make a judgment on that piece of foreign policy. But he went on to say that the witnesses, the evidence that had been provided in his court showed him unequivocally that this was genocide, a finding by a US judge. So that was a very important component. It's also the case that in both the hinted at in the initial preliminary ruling by the International Court of Justice on the genocide case and the full ruling of the court, the International Court of Justice, on an earlier case that had been brought 3 years ago by the General Assembly of the United Nations that asked the court for an advisory opinion on the legality or illegality of the entire Israeli occupation project, what we call genocide and what we call apartheid. And the court issued an extraordinary report. It took almost 3 years, 2.5 years, but that report said that the entire project of Israeli settlement was illegal, that all the settlers were illegal, and that they all should be evacuated within 1 year, by the end of this year. It went on to say that every government who is a member of the United Nations General Assembly and a signatory to the International Court of Justice as a result is obligated to abide by a set of rules based on that ruling that they had issued, but knowing that they do not have the capacity for enforcement. They don't have an army, they don't have a police force, they don't even have a process server. The enforcement comes back to us, to civil society. And the model here is, what the court said is it goes back to the United Nations. The United Nations has to enforce this. So it goes first to the Security Council, where, of course, as usual, the US vetoes it. But then it goes to the General Assembly, where there's no veto. And they pass this amazing resolution based on the court's decision that all of the occupation is illegal, that all the settlers must be evacuated, that no country should be selling arms to Israel or buying arms from Israel, that there should be an economic boycott. It goes on, really beyond what the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, has called for.
Isn't Yemen doing what the ICJ
one can certainly argue,
is asking?
yes, one can certainly argue that as the top human rights official of the United Nations, formerly in New York, Craig Mochaber, recently wrote in Mondoweiss that it is only Yemen that is overtly doing what the court calls for in preventing arms from going to Israel, preventing the sales, preventing the money. I think that is the argument. That is absolutely the argument. But it's also important that there is a role for us to play in this as civil society. And the model we have to look at, again, comes back to South Africa. Because if you remember in the 1980s, in the anti-apartheid movement, there were efforts all over the country, all over the world, to impose sanctions on South Africa. And finally, the UN General Assembly called for sanctions, and so country after country, government after government, started implementing that. It wasn't because the Assembly could force them to, but because they were told, there were mobilizations, protests in their streets, saying, we demand our government abide by what the General Assembly said. And the Assembly said, sanctions on South Africa to stop apartheid. And eventually, enough of them did that the US was under such pressure that Congress finally passed a sanctions resolution. And when Ronald Reagan vetoed it, they were able to get the votes to overturn the veto, and finally the US imposed sanctions. That's the model for us today. Governments around the world are starting to impose sanctions on Israel already for its violations of international law, for its violations of the Apartheid Convention, its violations of the Genocide Convention. And now it's up to us to follow that and say that's going to be the basis of pressure on our country as well. That's what will stop it. The point you started with, Michel, is so key about what Israel understood about US support. And if you remember what happened during the early months of the genocide, and then continued, when you had the president of this country and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense all saying things like, please don't kill so many Palestinians. This has really gone too far. This is a red line. All kinds of things like that. But they continued to send the weapons. So why should Netanyahu believe them? Why should he care what they say? Because actions speak louder than words. And when you are the president of the most powerful country in the world with the most powerful military that ever existed in history, and you are giving to this other country everything they want, why do we think they should care about what they say in the meantime? I'm heartbroken. Well, he probably was heartbroken. He's a kind of emotional guy, President Biden. But frankly, what difference does it make if he's heartbroken or not? The day that the humanitarian workers from World Central Kitchen were killed, 7 in a targeted attack on their cars, their marked cars, arranged with the Israeli military, who knew they would be going through that area. 7 people, 6 of them were internationals. Maybe that was why President Biden was particularly heartbroken that day, but let's put that aside. He said he was heartbroken. He probably was. Most people in the world were. It was a horror show. 8 hours later, he signed the approval to send another $8 billion worth of weapons. So really, what does it matter whether he's heartbroken or not? And why should Netanyahu care?
You know, Gaza has been used as a laboratory for testing Israeli weapons, surveillance equipment, AI technology, drones and robotics and so on and so forth. And as a result of this experimentation, the largest number of people killed, maimed, injured, burned alive, as you just said, or remain under the rubble are children. Does this count as self-defense? As targeting Hamas terrorists, as our government and the mainstream media want us to believe? Or are they all receiving the same talking points from their Israeli handlers?
Not only are the US officials receiving their talking points from, I don't know if it's only their Israeli handlers, it's their own people and their own beliefs. We should not forget that President Biden has said over and over again that he is a Zionist. He says, I am a Zionist, and he goes back over and over and over again to his meeting in 1974 with Golda Meir when he told her that he would protect precious little Israel. 3 people that I talked to in and around Congress who had talked with Biden about this said when he talks about it, he puts his hands like this, holding precious little Israel, which maybe he thought it was back then, but no one who now knows of Israel's military capacity because of our support, we pay, of course, 40% of the entire Israeli military budget, the Israeli nuclear arsenal can believe that it is somehow a precious little jewel that has to be protected from outside. The Prime Minister of Israel and others have said there are no civilians. They include children within that. And then they blame Hamas because they're not able to protect those children from being killed by those bombs. The other thing we have to remember here, this is not just a normal war with more than usual casualties. This is an Israeli assault on a country, a territory, a land, and a people that it occupies. And international law is very, very clear that while a country has the right of self-defense against being attacked by another country, a country is being, in its view, attacked by people coming from a territory that it occupies, does not have the right to military attack on the country it occupies. Indeed, an occupied population living under military occupation has the right of self-defense, including the right of armed resistance to that occupation. Now, that right is not unlimited. That right does not include the right to attack civilians. So, for example, in the attack of October 7th, in the attack on southern Israel, the attacks that were first launched were on military targets, 2 different military bases, a number of checkpoints. Those attacks by Palestinians who had spent the last 17 years living under an enclosure, a prison, and had spent the last 55 years under military occupation, had the right to military resistance. The attacks that followed, some not by Hamas at all, the attacks that followed against civilians clearly were violations of international law. But the initial attacks on military targets were not. And the prohibition against an occupying power militarily assaulting the country, the territory that they occupy, is an absolute. So, yeah, there's no justification here for these attacks. They are known to be attacking areas where there are families and children. They have a name for it, and it's escaping me at the moment. They call it help me out here, it's something like the daddy policy. It's something as, you know what I'm talking about. Daddy's home, thank you. The daddy's home policy. For those of you who don't know what it means this is the strategic military decision when they have identified somebody that they believe, for whatever reason, whether it's true or not, that they believe to be a Hamas militant or somebody who once said they like Hamas or whatever it is, they choose to attack in their home when they know the family will be there as well and will be targeted as well. Daddy's home.
I mean, we've seen some horrific video footage and reports that have emerged of Israeli soldiers executing 15 paramedics over this past week. In addition, the UN has reported discovery of mass graves around the hospitals, and a number of hospitals containing the bodies of those executed Palestinians. I was really surprised to see that for the first time in mainstream media, like the New York Times, CNN, the BBC, reported on that story. Are we perhaps seeing a shift in the reporting, or is this a one-off thing?
I think we have to be careful here. I don't think this was the first time. It's not the norm, for sure. But there have been reports that have been important by the New York Times, by the BBC. This was a joint BBC-New York Times one. And it's not to say that they're doing a good job. They're not. The press still kind of sucks. But it is night and day different than what it was before the genocide began, what it was, say, 5 years ago, what it was 20 years ago. You and I were both co-founders of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights in 2001. Remember that? Remember those meetings? And we talked about the press then. The idea at that time, if somebody had told us that the word Nakba would be on the front page of the New York Times, ever, that the Washington Post would have Palestinian voices on the opinion page, we would have said, yeah, right, when cows fly. Well, cows are flying because movements have gone to work on the press. And the press has come under pressure that it's not okay for them to simply ignore the reality of Palestinian life and Palestinian death at the hands of Israeli occupation forces. So all of that has been underway. Is it where it needs to be? Of course not. It's not even close. But if we look at the work, for example, of IMEU, the Institute for Middle East Understanding, they started just a few years after the U.S. campaign did. And when they started, it was one person desperately trying to figure out a strategy for challenging the U.S. press and its inherent, continual, constant pro-Israel bias. And now they have a staff of, I think, 18 or 20 people scattered across the country. They can't keep up with their requests for information, for briefings, for background information, all of this. And as a result, not only of IMEU, but of the work of movements like all of you, movements like the U.S. campaign and so many others, has absolutely been transformed. If you remember, at the time of Operation Cast Lead, that was the first of these now sequential Israeli assaults on Gaza that have now culminated in a full-scale genocide. That one was started the day after Christmas of 2008 and went into the end of January the following year during the Obama administration. And during Cast Lead, one of the first things the Israelis did, and it was the first time they had done it, was to ban the press from Gaza, ban the international press. But they couldn't stop, and in fact there were front page pieces in the New York Times at that time, because there was a young woman stringer in Gaza, Takrid, what was her name, her last name? I'm so bad on names these days. I met her years later in Amsterdam, and we became good friends. But she was born and raised in Gaza. They couldn't get rid of her. She was there already. And she became not a stringer, but a full-time reporter for the New York Times with a byline on the front page almost every day for those 2 weeks. Because they had to rely on her, she was the only one. So we see this kind of distinction between their goals and what they can achieve. And now, with the combination of social media, when the brief moments come when there's electricity in Gaza, the first thing people do after hooking up the hospitals is to get a way of getting electricity to charge the phones and the computers to get the word out. And that means that we are all seeing it. That's what's been so different this time. Even in 2014, the last time that there was anything close to this level of absolute mindless assault, we never saw it like we're seeing it now. And without social media, that would not have been possible. And they can't stop it.
But our work is still cut out for us because,
absolutely.
I mean, even the liberal media is getting away with omissions and erasures and outright gaslighting, all the time. And
yes.
so many of us are trying to really establish a space for critical analysis as systematic erasure becomes the new normal. That's why I really feel that events like this one is so important, you know.
It's absolutely right. The work on the press has to continue. I mean, I think, you know, I always focus on how much it has changed, partly because it's true, but also because I don't think people want to come and join a movement that's been around for 35 years and hasn't been able to make any changes. We have made enormous changes, but the changes that need to be made is huge. It is a huge challenge. And some of it has to do with really old-fashioned kind of pressure on the old press, along with what we do with, you know, new versions of the press and you know, social media and all that. We have to be writing letters to the editor, calling radio talk shows. They still have radio talk shows, and an awful lot of people in this country listen to them. So calling them, whatever the topic is, saying, you know, this topic is very important, but isn't it also important that we be talking about how Israel is supporting the genocide in Gaza, and we're paying that, and that's why we don't have enough money to expand Medicare? There's a link here. You know, our near $1 trillion military budget, $1 trillion. Now they're asking for a full trillion for the year after, is a huge part of the reason that they can get away with saying, well, we don't have enough money for education and healthcare and jobs. We have enough money. We're just spending it on the wrong things. And we're letting the rich get away without paying taxes. That's the problem. The problem isn't that there is no money. There's plenty of money around. So this becomes very important, and the press is part of that. So using that, you know, to write op-eds and submit them. They won't all be published, but then you publish it on social media after that. But if you can get it first in the mainstream press, you're also reaching a new audience. And then people start getting angry when they realize how they're being duped. You know, what's being left out. You know, maybe somebody should start a column somewhere presumably in the alternative press, that's called, you know, what's not there today or something, you know, about all the news that's not fit to print by the New York Times. You know, the highlight of the slogan of the Washington Post these days is, democracy dies in darkness. Yeah, and this is the Washington Post that just decided that their opinion pages could only feature op-eds that were about personal freedom and market economy. That's it. And they have some other articles, but they're not considered editorials. They need to be challenged on that. And the challenge includes, what are you not covering when you say you're only going to include praise for capitalism as acceptable on your editorial pages, right? So this kind of campaign needs to continue, and there are great campaigns going on, but it's going to take an enormous amount of work. One of the most important areas for that is student newspapers, which right now students are under such attack in this country. Students who are supporting Palestinian rights face a higher risk than we ever did. And that has to be taken into account. One of the ways that can be challenged is in the student newspapers.
Yeah, and I was going to mention also that last May 7th, here on the UMass campus, 137 peaceful protesters, students, faculty, and people from the community were arrested, zip-tied, and spent the night in jail.
Some of them in this room.
Yes, I was going to say, I am in awe of all the student protesters, the student movement on the nation's university campuses. I mean, it's just been incredible, incredible. Today, we heard that the feds revoked the visas of 5 UMass students. So Trump is really trying to manufacture as much fear and chaos as possible in order to intimidate us into submission. Their first political persecutions have all targeted individuals who were bold enough to believe that constitutional guarantees of free expression extended to solidarity with Palestine. Howard Zinn said once, our old friend, said, "You can't be neutral on a moving train." So we desperately need to derail that fast-moving train with everything we've got. And organizing is, as you said, is how we protect ourselves.
It's absolutely right.
So-
And I think what's key here is that the goal of these arrests, these frightening, sort of thuggish arrests that are taking place on the streets and in dorm rooms and in people's homes, is not only to make good on this campaign promise of massive numbers of immigrants being kicked out of the country, but to frighten people. It's exactly the goal. It's not a sideline. That's the reason. That's the reason that we're seeing the arrest and the threats of deportation of people with student visas and people with green cards, and talk about people with who are naturalized citizens, so that all people become afraid to raise this. And the reality is, this isn't just people believing that they should have the right of free expression. The First Amendment does, by law, apply to everyone in this country, not only citizens. The Harry Bridges case, I don't know if there are students of labor history here, but anybody who's studied labor history knows the name of Harry Bridges, who was the longtime head of the Longshore Workers Union, who they tried to deport allegedly for his support of or affiliation with, they couldn't prove he was a member because he wasn't, but he was allegedly affiliating with and associating with members of the Communist Party. And when it went all the way up to the Supreme Court found not only was he not able to be deported, but that everyone in this country had the right of free speech. The problem is, the right only exists when there are people to stand up and defend it. When a president can say, I don't really care what the law says, I'm going to do it anyway, that becomes the new law unless there's a challenge. And the good thing is, the good news is, there are challenges going on in the courts all over this country right now. Immigration lawyers are getting no sleep, but they are challenging each of these individually and the principles behind them. And at the lower levels of the court, so far, mostly, we're winning. Not all, but mostly. As they go up, it's going to get harder, and we're going to have losses. We're going to lose some, and there's the danger that the Supreme Court is going to make good on the threats they indicated today, what it looks like they're leaning to. They haven't made a final ruling yet on these issues, like the president can use this 200-year-old law that says that the president can deport anybody they want, essentially, in wartime, when it's not wartime. This is not wartime, except what the U.S. is doing to other countries around the world.
But
Nobody's waging war on
There's a
us.
threat to national security.
Oh yeah, they're a threat to national security. Forgot about that, sorry. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about earlier about what we can do. Can you
Yeah.
say a few words about what effective organizing strategies that people can do in order to face such
Yeah.
horrific times that we are facing today?
Organizing is our answer to fascism. Organizing is our answer to genocide. The South African government made a great move against genocide by bringing this case to the International Court of Justice. Our job is to organize support for that case. Among other things, the U.S. right now is putting enormous pressure on South Africa, cutting all aid, ending crucial PEPFAR, the anti-AIDS medication that the U.S. is sending. 600,000 children around the world are likely, including in South Africa, to die of that. And so that's one little thing people can point to. But the key to the organizing is understanding that this is an attack on all of us. All of us are threatened by these threats of deportation. Those of us who have privileges, who perhaps were native-born citizens and don't face deportation under almost any conditions. There are a few exemptions. will face other precedents, other punishments. We are all at risk from these things. But because we're looking at a threat to all of our free speech, it also makes it easier to mobilize other people who maybe never thought much about Israel, maybe never cared much about Palestinians, but they sure as hell care about their own right to free speech being jeopardized. And when people start to understand that their own right is being threatened, that it's already being made a privilege and not a right, because it's only a right if everybody has it. If only some people have it, it's not a right at all. It's a privilege. And we don't want to be a country of privilege. This country was fought on the basis of not being a country where only some people have rights. So I think that our movement is stronger to the degree that we can intersect with the movement against what Trump is doing to our government, destroying foreign aid, destroying the Department of Education, threatening every government department that provides services to people who have paid for them. You know, they can say they're not going to touch Social Security, but by cutting half the staff of Social Security and closing potentially 1,200 offices and saying that people can no longer clarify their status by telephone, but they'll have to go to the office that no longer exists, and they're too old to drive because this is the program that's designed for people up into old age. They are cutting Social Security. That's what's at stake here. This is the same movement as the international version of it, which is what is happening to the people of Gaza. And it's also happening to people in Congo and people in Myanmar. So we have to be clear that the movement against genocide, the movement against fascism are part of the same movement. The movement for our rights at home against fascism at home has everything to do with Trump's foreign policy. That's the international version of what he's doing at home. And if we have any understanding of what is internationalism, what is solidarity, that's what our movement needs to look like. How many of you here were out in the streets on Saturday? Almost everybody. This is crucial. This is crucial because this movement was only, this set of protests was only the first one. There's going to be more. This by itself doesn't accomplish very much at all, but it sets a pattern. And it's also true that the people who made the first national call for these protests that went on all across the country did not include Gaza in their list of what we should be opposing. That's a huge challenge for us. But the good news is that there were Palestine contingents in virtually every one of those marches. And, which is great, and they were welcomed. So the isolation is of the people who made the stupid mistake of not including it, thinking that their base was going to object or that people weren't going to like it or that it's political suicide to criticize Israel. Well, it ain't political suicide anymore. If it ever was, it ain't no more. I'll give you one clear example. 77% of Democrats think there should be no more aid to Israel. 77%. That's unprecedented. So when the leaders of protest moments that happen to be led by movements of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party who are more worried about these things rather than the movement in the streets, they're going to make decisions like that and they're going to be proved wrong. We proved them wrong on Saturday, we're going to prove them wrong again. Maybe next time they'll get it and they'll include it. But whether they do or not, we are there because we are part of the same movement. There's a price to be paid. We have to be able and willing to support those of us who are the most vulnerable. We have to encourage people who right now maybe are out of status, maybe are undocumented, maybe are potentially going to lose a student visa because they're graduating and they don't know if their graduate school program is still going to survive Trump's cuts. Maybe they should not go to the protest because the risk is too great. So we have to recruit 5 more people who are white US citizens to show up to take their place. That's what solidarity has to look like. And that's what organizing looks like now.
I totally agree with you that US repression and fascism at home can't be separated from US-supported oppression and genocidal practices abroad. The best way to deal with our hopelessness is to remain active and fight for what we believe in. That's how we make a difference. I want to talk about the surge of student activism over Gaza is just one of the many signs that a different, better world is possible. And it's really heartening to see young American Jews and young Arab Americans and young progressives from all walks of life organizing, marching together, protesting together, speaking up against racism, war, colonialism, neoliberalism, tyrannical governments, and climate crisis, and repressive policies of the Trump administration. This is so great. Over 300 protesters from Jewish Voice for Peace, as you know, flooded the lobby of the Trump Tower recently with signs, "Not in our name." They did that at Capitol Hill and so on and so forth. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. You know, this, on some level, at the level of movement building and changing the discourse, changing public understanding, changing the media, and just barely beginning to change the policies. That's the hardest. That comes last. And that's a problem when you don't have time when you're facing a genocide. But at these levels, the rise of this movement has been so extraordinary, and the students who came out and formed these encampments, not only because they were protesting 24/7 and needed a place to sleep, but because it was symbolic of the Nakba, because it was symbolic of where their grandparents and great-grandparents, when they were expelled from their homes and dispossessed of their land in 1947 and 48, they were forced to live in tents for years until the UN and others assisted in building shacks instead of tents. So the tents became symptomatic of that and symbolic in the protest world. And we saw, this is very much a generational shift that's underway. Jewish Voice for Peace has doubled in size in the 18 months of the genocide, despite making a decision not to recruit people, not to go out recruiting, because it just seemed wrong to use this moment to pull people into a new organization. But people came, flooding to them. The number of Jews participating in the encampments was enormous, because young Jews are now growing up with an understanding of what Jewish identity means, completely the opposite of what I grew up with as a young Jewish kid in California, where being Jewish meant supporting Israel. That's sort of what it was. We never thought about anything else. It wasn't really challenging anything. That was just it. Now, you have young Jews who grew up they're part of the justice generation. Maybe they grew up after the killing of Michael Brown in 2014 in Ferguson, or grew to political maturity in 2020 with the killing of George Floyd and the protests that summer that rocked this country. And it was young black people and young Jews and all people of color, everybody was out in the streets saying, this is not acceptable. This is racism, and that we need to build a movement against racism, and that the movement for justice, the justice generation, was centered in these young people. And that's still the case. You know, the idea that for Jewish kids to grow up thinking that being a Jew means being part of a movement for social justice, working with the black kids that have grown up knowing that their own neighbors, their own friends who have faced this kind of murderous policing in this country are now fighting back in a whole new way with this much broader coalition of people from across the world, starting with the young people, starting with the students. So it's not surprising that in this stage, when Trump comes in, he is starting first with the students. They won't be the last, and they're not the only ones, but they're the first, and it's first the students who stood up for someone else, who stood up for Palestine, who stood up for the right to speak, who are being singled out. There will be others,
I mean, for a long time, it must have felt as though you were swimming against the tide. I mean, I know that we've known each other for a long time. You're seen as either naive or a self-hating Jew for so long, but you and I yesterday we were discussing an article written by a friend of ours, Rami Khouri, and he's a brilliant journalist. In it, he says that Palestine has become an important U.S. domestic issue, like never before. We've seen how public discourse has changed over the last 10, 15 years, and more so over the past 18 months. But as you said, this is only happening at the public level. We have not seen that discourse change at the level of our elected officials.
Maybe you and I will disagree a little bit for the first time in our long history together. Because Rami and I spoke together in Boston day before yesterday, and we talked about this in our presentations. We have started the process of changing the political discourse, the policy discourse. It isn't there yet, clearly. But the fact that you had 4 weeks ago, 19 members of the Senate voting to sign a joint letter of disagreement to the White House to try to prevent a part of this aid to Israel has never happened before. Now, 19 members, when there's 100 there, that's not enough. But it was 40% of the Democrats in the Senate. That's huge. We have to look at it in this historical context, right? That had never happened before. I had never thought that I would live to see the day when a politician, let alone a president, could be thrown out of office for being too pro-Israeli. I never thought that could happen. And she was. It's not the only reason. We have to be very careful here. There were all kinds of reasons that people didn't vote for Kamala Harris. One of them was that for the right reasons, in my view, the uncommitted movement was very focused on the primaries and did not tell people what they should do in the election. It was a very hard decision, knowing what the alternative was going to be, what we're now seeing. And we have to be clear that it's not as if something is better now in Gaza than it was or would be under the old regime. But it was because of that failure. You all know about the poll that showed, do you know about the poll? Maybe not. I'll tell you one other poll. The poll it was a very specific target. People who voted for Biden in 2020 and did not vote for Biden in 2020, for Harris in 2024. Now that included people who didn't vote at all, people who voted for Trump, people who voted for Mickey Mouse, or people who voted and wrote in Gaza, or anything in between, but did not vote for Harris and had voted for Biden. They were given 6 options. Pick the most important reason that you didn't vote for Harris. There were 6, and we know that you had many, but pick the most important one. When I heard about that poll, I said, well, obviously the first was the economy. Well, no, the economy was second with 26%. The first was Gaza with 29%, the Middle East. That was huge. I kind of shook when I read that because I thought it can't be right. And then, of course, we have to do the education that makes people understand that that's actually still the right thing to have done for many people who were being asked to vote for someone who was funding and arming the army that was killing their own families. And understanding that meant that, yes, the consequences are horrific of the fact that Kamala Harris didn't win. They would have been horrific in all kinds of ways if she had won. Our work wouldn't have been over. But our work is horrific now because she didn't win. And that is a reality we never saw before.
And has the Israel-Palestine become a major domestic political issue because the government's pro-Israeli actions are effectively degrading American citizens' constitutional rights and are generating a huge pushback? Is that?
I think right now that is the case. What Trump is doing right now with these arrests, with this thuggish, deliberately terrifying behavior. This isn't just about jerking somebody's visa and notifying them, sorry, you're going to have to leave the country, you've got 24 hours or whatever. That's horrifying. But that's not even what they're doing. They're not telling people that they're removing their visas, that they're deeming them unacceptable in this country. So they're walking down the street, in one case obviously at Tufts, coming back from an iftar dinner, and suddenly accosted on the street by 6 people dressed in black with hoods and masks, no identification who they are, grabbed, handcuffed, and thrown into an unmarked car. That's the action of fascism, fascist governments. We see it all around the world. We haven't seen that here very much. That's what this is. But it's also because before Trump came into office, before the election, when President Biden was in charge, we saw the support for policies that were unacceptable to people in this country who are human beings and were not prepared to watch their tax dollars be used to destroy life at this scale. It's not like we had never destroyed life before, let's be clear. Many people in the US cheered when the US went to war in Afghanistan, 88% in fact. A lot of people, we don't like to admit it, but a lot of people also cheered about Iraq. And for many years, many people cheered for Vietnam, for killing Vietnamese. But this was different. And massive numbers of people have said, this is not okay. It went too far. For us to see this made real what had only been reported in few arenas of the media. So it is what you just said, Michel, that it is a recognition that our rights are threatened. That should make our mobilization, our organizing easier. But it also means we have to work harder, because what we are facing is not even close to what people in Gaza are facing. So it just means we have to work harder to stop that primary problem, which will then bring an end to what we're facing here at home.
In a rare piece of good news, we heard over the weekend that Francesca Albanese, her mandate as UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestine has been renewed, despite very heavy lobbying by the US mission to the UN and Israel to remove her from the post because of she is an outspoken critic of Israeli policies. So there was a relentless campaign by UN Watch, the World Jewish Congress, by the Zionist youth organization, this Baddar. You were twice shortlisted for this UN job. Tell us who Francesca Albanese is and what does a UN Special Rapporteur do?
Very briefly, because we're getting the word that we need to wrap up, partly because we need to sign some books out here. But I will say, I was shortlisted twice. I never thought I was going to get it, and I was quite surprised to be shortlisted. But Francesca Albanese is a hero of mine. Francesca is an Italian lawyer. She taught at Georgetown. She's a human rights lawyer for many years, has written books on how the law has betrayed Palestinian rights, et cetera. The UN Special Rapporteurs, which are some of them focus on specific issues and some on specific regions, are human rights observers. They are appointed by the UN Human Rights Council, but they are not UN employees. For one, they're not paid. They get airfare twice a year for 2 trips a year, but that's it. They have to raise their own money to do their work. Also, they are not UN employees, so they can't be fired directly by the UN except by the Human Rights Council. But their job is to investigate charges of human rights violations, either in a specific territory, a specific area, like the occupied Palestinian territory, which is, when you think about it, it's actually a rather narrow mandate. She is not mandated to investigate the inequality by law of the treatment of Jews and non-Jews inside 48 Israel. So she has a narrow mandate that's only the occupied territory. But within that mandate, she can look at all the various violations being carried out against Palestinians. And she has been brilliant. Her reports have been brilliant. They've been used by civil society groups all around the world. She has been bold and brave. She was attacked viciously in Germany. They tried to shut down an event that she was speaking at the law school. And when they finally allowed it to go forward, it was with thuggish-looking police, German police, surrounding the room. You know, and she has stood back and said, as a citizen of Europe, I find this appalling. And it never even occurred to her to step down. So I think we have to have one more question to end. And then
very, very quickly, yes, I didn't realize the time had passed so quickly. There are so many other issues that we wanted to talk about. One thing I wanted to ask you about very, very briefly is to talk about Trump's appointee as U.S. ambassador to Israel, this uber Zionist evangelical Christian Mike Huckabee, who doesn't think Palestinians exist.
Well, you just said all that needs to be said. He doesn't, this is a man who has said publicly there is no such thing as a Palestinian. He took the words right out of the mouth of Golda Meir, who famously said there is no such thing as the Palestinian people. He is an extreme Christian Zionist, and for those of you not familiar with Christian Zionism, it is a religious belief by some Christians that say that the second coming of Christ can only happen with the ingathering of Jews into Palestine, and that at the end of the day, when Christ comes, Jews will all either convert or die. Which, for those of us who are Jewish, it's not a great choice, you know. But the more important point is, he says there is no such thing as a Palestinian person. He supports the full Israeli annexation of the West Bank. A very, very dangerous person to be representing allegedly U.S. interests in Israel. So there's a campaign underway right now because his confirmation hearing should be coming up within the next week, I think. So keep your eye out for Mike Huckabee. Very bad guy.
Before we close, I just want to mention that we hear a lot in mainstream media about Israeli hostages, which is horrific, and I think they need to be released. But I also want to mention that something that you do not hear in mainstream media is that there are over 10,000 Palestinian hostages languishing in Israeli jails today.
Can I say one word about that? I think the problem that it's not mentioned is huge. It is mentioned when there are negotiations underway, and we often get feedback saying, pushback saying, why are there so many Palestinian prisoners being released and so few hostages? It's because the Palestinians have not taken 10,000 Israeli prisoners, and Israel has illegally captured them and taken them out of their territory, their country, into Israel, another violation of international law, including children.
And until Palestinians get their freedom and their equality, every Palestinian from the river to the sea remains a hostage. We can take a few questions now.
I've been thinking so much about this and wonder what your thoughts are. What's happening within Israel? Is there any movement, any change, any civilian action against the occupation and the genocide?
Yeah, it's a really important question. The answer, I would say, is yes and no. There is a lot of motion underway in Israeli civil society. The society is a very divided one, very much like here. About half the population is outraged at what is happening to the hostages and the failure of their own government to do what they recognize is necessary to get the hostages released, which is to have a ceasefire and end the war. That's how you get hostages released. It's happened twice. It's worked both times. And both times Israel has then said, we're going to violate it and go back to war. So the chances of getting any new hostages out, as long as the war continues, is pretty slim. The other half basically agree with the dominant position of the government and the majority in the Knesset that says the most important thing is to kill anyone who ever said the word Hamas and expel all the Palestinians and take over Gaza and occupy it, reoccupy it. Gaza, just a note, is still occupied because the definition of occupation is control by another country. When they withdrew the troops from Gaza in 2005, they didn't withdraw them, they just redeployed them from inside the wall to outside the wall. So it is still occupied. So what we're looking at is massive level of mobilization and excitement and whatever from the Israeli public without mentioning Palestinian rights and without the ability to actually stop the war. For the others, they agree the war should go on. And that is the dominant position in the Knesset, and because the Israeli elections for Jews is quite democratic, it is a good representation of where public opinion is. The only other thing I would say is that we should keep in mind, if you remember just before October 7th, there were these massive protests just roiling Israeli society about these really extremist moves of the Netanyahu administration taking away the independence of the courts. And they were having 4,000 or 5,000 people in the streets every weekend. But they did that by making sure that no one ever mentioned the occupation. Because if they did, it would have been 5,000 or 6,000, not 500,000 or 600,000. And they had no influence. So the Israeli left, and they are brave, and they are creative, and they are smart, and they could mainly fit in this room. That's the problem we face. It's moved dramatically to the right, and it's unfortunately on the opposite chronological vision as we have here. The generational shift is the opposite. The most racist, the most militaristic forces in Israel are the youngest, and it goes up from there. So.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Hey, so I guess coming from like thinking about culture work as a writer, editor, organizer, I'd love to hear from a politics, foreign policy, et cetera, kind of standpoint, what you see the usefulness of culture work in like a time like now from your decades of experience, because on one hand it's like, okay, we're desperately trying to politicize and activate and radicalize and bring the political theory into, like, you cannot talk about the aesthetics without, you know, these sanitizations, et cetera, working against CIA kind of funded entities like PEN America, for example, that have been sanitizing the art scenes and whatnot. And so there's a lot of great campaigns, you know, same like Wow Writers Against the War in Gaza, pressuring the media, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I guess, you know, it's like bringing the politics into the culture is often a direction of the conversation, but where, from your standpoint, I'm just curious, selfishly, to hear your thoughts on where the culture scene should be going or could be pushing. What are some strategic openings, for instance, that you see for us?
I gotta say, I think the culture scene on Palestine is way ahead of the political scene. And I say that as somebody who's not a culture vulture. I love it, but I don't feel like I contribute to it. I absorb it, I love it, but it's not what I produce. It's what Michel produces, what the Debka dance troops produce. It's the poets. The poets of Palestine have done more than anybody. It's extraordinary, and I think that's why books are so important. Some of the new books coming from Interlink, you know, Rifat Al-Arir's book of poetry and essays has transformed how people think about poetry. The great poet who created the Great March of Return in 2018, it was a poet who watched a bird flying over the wall that surrounds Gaza, who started thinking, and he wrote a poem about what it would be like to fly above the wall, and then said, you know, we can't fly, but maybe we could like march, we could walk within our own land. And they announced there was going to be this great March of Return. And they didn't attack the wall, but they marched in their own territory, and Israel had announced ahead of time they would meet that march with sharpshooters. And they did. And 217 young boys and men and 2 women, women, were shot and face amputation as a result. It was planned, it was deliberate, and this was 5 years before October 7th. So the work of the poets, of the essayists, the artists who have turned the wall into a work of art, this is what Palestine has become. The use of the watermelon symbolism is now global. It's everywhere. It's the watermelon and the key, what the Palestinians being expelled in 1948 carried with them because they thought that they would be back in 3 weeks when the war was over. And they locked their house and fled, or were kicked out physically, or were killed. But their children carried the key. And the Israeli government of the time, even before it was a state, the government of the Irgun and the Haganah said, we don't have to worry about it. The old people will die, their children will forget, and their grandchildren will never know. But they were wrong. The old people started to die, but their children never forgot. And the grandchildren learned it all. So that's where we are.
Thank you for your talk. It's very, is this on? My question is about, as we sit here in the Indian Ocean, the U.S. has massive buildup of military in the Indian Ocean, B-52 bombers, and there's a threat of a potential American attack on Iran. And could you address the ramifications of a unjustified attack of a sovereign nation of Iran by the U.S. military?
Yeah, thanks.
And one
I will.
thing is,
Okay.
Russia has 6,000 nuclear weapons. The U.S. has a little bit less, 6,000 nuclear weapons. Estimated Israel has maybe 300. And this could escalate to World War III.
Right. The threat around Iran right now is very severe. The meeting that was held yesterday between Netanyahu and Trump, Iran was the top item on the agenda. It wasn't what got the most press. That was the tariffs, which I think we can probably anticipate will be reduced for Israel, if not for anybody else. But the real question is, what did Trump agree to from Netanyahu? We don't know yet. We don't know if the threat of a war against Iran is imminent or not. There is an announcement that the U.S. intends to meet with some Iranian officials on Saturday. But we do know that the crisis that is underway in Gaza is all of what is linked back to the question of Iran. The role of Hamas, which had broken with Iran many years ago, in fact, but other parts of what is known, mistakenly in my view, but whatever, as the axis of resistance in the region, are linked to Iran in U.S. propaganda continuously. So that how people in this country come to see Iran is through the eyes of what they see of attacks on Israel. In fact, it has been Israel for many years, of course, that has attacked Iran, both directly with missiles and more frequently with assassinations of scientists to prevent them not from getting a nuclear weapon, but from having nuclear knowledge, including for medical uses, for example, and research uses. So the danger remains very severe, and we have to keep a very sharp eye on it because all of these issues become regional very, very quickly, much faster than we can ever control them. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. Phyllis will be in the back. There are books available for sale, and she will be happy to sign copies.